They never imagined they would be capable of enduring something like this. They had always seen themselves as strong, someone who was in control of their life, until that day arrived and shattered everything they thought they knew about themselves. It wasn't until that moment that they realized just how much unresolved pain they carried deep inside them, pain they thought they had buried long ago. They would never forget the exact feeling they had when they walked into their room and saw the photo left on their desk. It was a photo from their childhood, an image of a younger, innocent version of themselves. The child in that picture was unaware of the harsh realities that would soon come crashing down, unaware of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The photo, however, was more than just a simple memory. It was a message, a haunting reminder of the life they had been forced to live, a life shaped by abandonment and a deep sense of neglect. And the message written in red ink on the back of the photo, "The best father in the world," hit them harder than anything they had felt before. It wasn't just words, it was a dagger in the heart, one that seemed to cut right through the years of pretending that they had moved on. The anger began to rise within them, bubbling up from a place they hadn't accessed in years. They couldn't breathe. The tears that had been buried for so long threatened to break free, but this time, there was no place for them. No time for tears. It was a long-buried anger that had now surfaced in full force. They didn't just feel anger, though. They felt a coldness, a deep sense of betrayal that shook them to their core. How could someone do this to their own child? How could their own flesh and blood abandon them so cruelly without a second thought? In that instant, it all became clear. It was no longer about their past or the years of confusion and hurt. It was about making sure that their father would never forget the consequences of his actions. The past couldn't be undone, but the future could be shaped. The moment they saw that photo, they knew what they had to do. There was no going back. It wasn't about revenge in the sense of violence. It was about forcing their father to feel everything they had felt all these years. They needed him to know the pain of abandonment, the isolation that came with it, the relentless weight of being forgotten. And the most shocking thing was that they were absolutely certain they could make him feel all of that. Everything around them, the way the photo had triggered this response, seemed to fall into place. The decision was made. They couldn't turn back. They had the power now, the power to act, and the sense of justice that had always eluded them became a driving force that could no longer be ignored. They had been left behind once, but they would never let that happen again. The night felt heavy, the kind of silence that creeps up on you and settles deep inside. They could still hear the faint echoes of their father's words, the ones he had said so many years ago, right before abandoning them in the middle of the storm. "You'll be better off without me," he had told them. Those words had haunted them for as long as they could remember, and in that moment they realized how much they had shaped their life. It wasn't just that their father had left them, it was the way he had convinced them, in his own twisted way, that they were better off alone. They had spent so many years convincing themselves that it was true, trying to bury the part of them that still longed for their father's love and approval. They had tried to move on, to build a life without him, but deep down, they never stopped feeling abandoned, never stopped feeling that nagging emptiness that would always linger. And yet, in a way, it was almost freeing to confront those emotions head-on. They didn't need their father's approval anymore. In fact, they realized they had never needed it. What they needed was to reclaim their own sense of power, to take control of their own life, and not let his actions define them any longer. The decision to confront him wasn't driven by a desire for revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure he faced the consequences of what he had done. There was no closure in their past. There were only wounds that had never healed. But this was their chance to change that. They didn't know what the next steps would look like, but they knew one thing for sure. They would make their father understand the weight of his actions. It was time for him to face the pain he had caused, to feel the same sense of betrayal and isolation that had shaped their life. They couldn't forget the years of suffering, the cold nights spent alone, but they didn't want to dwell in that darkness anymore. They wanted to make sure their father understood the impact of his choices, because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about breaking the cycle, about ensuring that someone like him would never get away with something like this again. The moment they made that decision, something inside them shifted. It was like a switch had been flipped, and all the fear and hesitation that had once held them back evaporated. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was uncertain, and they didn't know if they would succeed, but they understood that this was their moment. They had the power to change the narrative, to take their story back from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long, and they weren't going to let that opportunity slip away. With every step they took toward their father, they could feel the weight of their past slowly lifting. It wasn't that they were letting go of the pain. It was that they were taking control of it. They were no longer a victim of the past. They were the author of their future. This was just the beginning, and they would not let fear stop them. The drive to their father's estate felt surreal, as though they were moving through a fog. Their hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white from the pressure. It was as if their body was acting on autopilot, moving forward even though their mind was still processing the enormity of what they were about to do. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering gates standing like a fortress, a symbol of everything their father had built while they had been left to fend for themselves. The world outside the car seemed distant, as though nothing else mattered except the moment that was unfolding. They couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that everything that had happened in their life had led them to this point. There was no going back. The coldness they had felt in their chest was now a burning fire, and it was the only thing that could keep them moving forward. They had spent so many years trying to bury the resentment, trying to forget what had been done to them. But in that car, all those years of pain and neglect were flooding back, and it was clear they couldn't run from it anymore. Their father had spent decades building a life of luxury, while they had struggled to survive. The injustice of it all was enough to make them sick to their stomach. And yet, in the pit of their heart, there was a small, nagging question. What would it feel like to confront him? Would it give them the peace they so desperately sought, or would it just open old wounds that could never heal? The car stopped at the entrance, and they took a deep breath before stepping out. The wind howled, the rain began to fall harder, and the cold pierced through their clothes. They stood there for a moment, just looking at the grand house before them. It was like staring at a ghost, a reminder of everything they had lost, everything that had been stolen from them. They felt the weight of the years of suffering, of waiting for something that would never come. This moment wasn't just about confronting their father. It was about confronting the life they had been forced to live. The pain, the anger, the feeling of being abandoned, it all came rushing back. But they didn't let it stop them. They couldn't afford to. They were here for justice, and they weren't leaving without it. As they walked toward the front door, their heart pounded in their chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. They thought about what they would say, how they would make their father understand the depth of what he had done. But as they raised their hand to knock, all their thoughts faded away. It didn't matter what they said. What mattered was that they were finally taking control. For the first time in their life, they weren't waiting for someone to save them. They were saving themselves. And no matter what happened next, they knew they had made the right choice. The door swung open, and there he stood. Richard, their father, looked almost as they remembered, though the years had left their mark on him. The man who had once seemed so untouchable, so full of confidence and power, now appeared smaller, older, a shadow of the person he used to be. His eyes widened in shock as he took in the sight of them, standing there, as if he couldn't believe they were real. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was deafening, thick with years of unspoken words, unanswered questions, and all the emotions that had been buried for so long. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Their heart raced, but they stood firm. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when they would finally confront the man who had abandoned them without a second thought. Richard's voice broke the silence, but it was shaky, uncertain. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone betraying a sense of fear, something they had never expected from him. The rich, powerful man who had seemed to hold all the cards was now standing there, vulnerable, exposed. For the first time, they saw him not as their father, but as a man who was no longer in control, someone who had been running from his past for far too long. Their eyes narrowed, their voice steady as they spoke, though the anger and pain still simmered beneath the surface. "You left me. You abandoned me when I was just a child." The words came out in a rush, as if once they started, they couldn't stop. All the years of suffering, of fighting to survive without the one person who should have been there for them, all of that came pouring out in that one sentence. Richard looked at them, his face showing no sign of recognition. But that wasn't surprising. He had never truly seen them, not as a person, not as his child, but as a burden, something to be discarded when it no longer served him. They had spent years pretending that it didn't matter, that they were strong enough to move on, but deep down they had always wondered why. Why had he done it? Why had he left them to suffer? And now, standing in front of him, they knew they would never get the answers they had longed for, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were finally here, face to face with the man who had destroyed their sense of security, their sense of self-worth. And they wouldn't back down. They couldn't. Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room as if looking for a way out. But there was no escape from the truth. It had caught up to him, and now he had to face it, just as they had to face everything he had done to them. The years of loneliness, of being abandoned, of struggling to survive. It had all led to this moment, and now there would be no turning back. Richard took a step back, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his graying hair. It was almost as if he couldn't process the reality of the situation. For so many years he had lived in his bubble, in his world of wealth and power, thinking that he could escape the consequences of his actions. But now, standing there in front of the child he had abandoned, everything was different. He no longer seemed like the powerful man he had once been. There was no more bravado in his posture, no more arrogant confidence in his voice. All that was left was a man who had finally been forced to reckon with the past. I never wanted this for you," Richard muttered, though his words seemed hollow, almost rehearsed. The regret in his eyes was unmistakable, but it felt too little, too late. They stared at him, taking in his words but not feeling any relief. There was no catharsis in hearing him speak. His regret, his apology, none of it could undo the years of abandonment, the years of feeling like they weren't worthy of love or protection. They had spent so long believing that maybe, just maybe, they could make peace with the past. But this was something different. They weren't looking for an apology anymore. They were looking for something much deeper, something that their father could never give them. They had already given up on waiting for him to save them, to love them the way they had always hoped. What they needed now was justice, not because they wanted to hurt him, but because they needed to feel that they had reclaimed some power over their own life. The power that had been stolen from them. The power that their father had taken when he decided to leave them behind. Richard took another step back, his face flushing as if he couldn't bear to face them anymore. His eyes shifted toward the door as if considering running away, but something held him there. Maybe it was the recognition that there was no place to run, no way to hide anymore. The consequences had arrived. "Please, I'm sorry," Richard said again, his voice cracking. "I never meant for you to suffer. I thought it was the best thing to do. I thought I was doing what was right." The words felt like a cheap excuse, a feeble attempt at justifying the unjustifiable. They weren't interested in his reasons. They had heard enough of those over the years. They didn't want to hear about his struggles, his guilt, or his reasoning. What mattered now was that they had finally found the strength to confront him, to stand there and demand something they had never had. The truth. Not his version of it, not his apology, but the truth about what he had done to them and why it had taken so long for him to acknowledge the damage he had caused. "You thought it was right?" They couldn't stop themselves from asking. "You thought it was right to leave your child, to abandon me in the forest like I was nothing?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unforgiving. Richard's face turned pale, and for the first time they saw a flicker of real fear in his eyes. Not the fear of punishment or consequence, but the fear of finally facing the truth of his actions, a truth he had hidden from for years. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. There was nothing left to say. There were no more excuses. They had said everything they needed to say, and now it was up to him to live with the weight of his choices. They had done their part. Now they would let him live with the consequences of abandoning his own flesh and blood. The tension in the room was unbearable, and yet, strangely, it felt like a weight had been lifted off their chest. The years of holding on to that anger, that deep sense of abandonment, had finally found an outlet. They could see it in Richard's face, the struggle within him, the realization that he could no longer escape what he had done. For the first time, they could sense that he understood the gravity of his actions. It wasn't just the guilt written on his face. It was the shame that seemed to consume him, and that, in a way, was enough for them. It didn't matter if he apologized or if he begged for their forgiveness. They had waited too long for that, and the truth was that it wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was that they had found the strength to confront him, to face the man who had caused them so much pain. And in that moment they realized that the closure they had been searching for all these years wasn't something their father could give them. It wasn't something that could be wrapped up neatly with an apology or a tearful confession. It was something they had to give to themselves. They could feel it in their bones. The truth of it. They didn't need him anymore. Not in the way they once thought they did. Not in the way they had craved his approval, his love, his presence. They had survived without him. They had built their own life, their own identity. They didn't need to be his child to be whole. The realization was freeing, like a door opening to a new life they had never imagined for themselves. They had spent so many years feeling like they were incomplete, like something vital was missing. But now, they saw it clearly. They had everything they needed within themselves. It was a powerful, almost overwhelming feeling. The freedom to let go of the past, to stop waiting for their father to fix things. It didn't matter that he had abandoned them. They had become strong in his absence. And now as they stood there face to face with the man who had once been their everything, they could finally say with certainty that they didn't need him anymore. Not in the way they once thought. Not in the way they had been conditioned to believe. Richard, for all his power and wealth, had never been able to offer them the one thing they truly needed: unconditional love and care. And now, standing there, they realized that the only love they needed was their own. It wasn't the apology that they had imagined in their head all these years. It wasn't the moment of reconciliation that they had so desperately wanted. It was the moment when they realized they were whole, with or without their father. They had carried the burden of abandonment for so long, but now that burden was no longer theirs to bear. They were free. Richard's expression faltered, his eyes darting between the anger in their gaze and the silence that had settled between them like an impenetrable wall. For a moment, he seemed to shrink, as if the enormity of the situation had finally hit him. His once confident demeanor was replaced by a look of uncertainty, even desperation. He had spent his life convincing himself that he could escape the consequences of his actions, that the world would continue to turn in his favor as long as he kept his wealth and status intact. But in the face of his child, standing there with nothing but the raw truth in their eyes, he realized how fragile that illusion had been. It wasn't just about the money, or the power, or the houses and cars. All of it had become meaningless. He had built a life on the backs of others, stepping on whoever stood in his way, and it had all been for nothing. The foundation of his success was hollow. His empire, his riches. They could never replace the one thing that truly mattered: the love of his child, the one person he had discarded. It was a sobering thought, and for the first time, Richard had to confront the truth that his choices had cost him more than he was willing to admit. They watched him, silently, giving him space to process what had been said, to come to terms with the reality that no amount of wealth could fix what had been broken. Richard opened his mouth as though he were about to speak, but no words came out. He closed his eyes as if trying to collect his thoughts, but the silence between them only grew heavier. They didn't need him to speak, though. They didn't need his apology or his remorse. What mattered now was that they had spoken their truth. They had been the ones to break the silence, to call out the injustice of it all. They weren't waiting for validation anymore. They were no longer that scared child abandoned in the woods, waiting for a father who would never return. They were someone different now, someone stronger, someone who had faced the past and wasn't afraid to confront it head-on. And in that silence, they realized that the healing could finally begin. Not because their father had apologized, but because they had given themselves the closure they needed. The past had no more hold over them. They were free. And for the first time, they felt a deep sense of peace. A peace that came from knowing they had taken control of their own story. No more waiting. No more wondering. They had moved beyond the pain and anger. They had become the person they needed to be, whole, capable, and unapologetically strong. Richard's gaze lingered on them for a long while, his features now soft with regret. But the silence that filled the room was not one of resolution. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on both of them. For a fleeting moment, Richard seemed to acknowledge the weight of what had been said, the years of pain and abandonment finally coming to the surface. But the moment passed, and they both knew that nothing would change. There was no magical phrase, no heartfelt apology that could fix the past, no tearful confession that would heal the years of suffering. As much as they may have once hoped for it, they knew now that no reconciliation was possible. It wasn't the closure they had imagined in their head for all these years, but it was the closure they had needed. It had come not in the form of their father asking for forgiveness, but in the form of their own self-realization. They were free. They had the power to let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the hurt that had been holding them back for so long. And as they stood there in that room, face to face with the man who had abandoned them, they realized they were no longer that lost child in the forest waiting for a father who would never come. They had become something else, something stronger. The chains of the past that had kept them bound had been broken, and they were no longer shackled by the memories of their abandonment. There was no need to stay and continue the conversation. They had spoken their truth, and there was nothing left to say. They turned to leave, their steps confident, their mind resolute. It wasn't about punishing Richard or forcing him to feel the weight of his actions. It was about reclaiming their own peace. It was about walking away from the past with their head held high, knowing they had made the choice to no longer let it define them. Outside, the storm had passed, and the sky was clearing. The world seemed different somehow, quieter, as if everything around them was finally at rest. They took a deep breath, the air crisp and fresh. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to step forward into a life that was no longer defined by what had happened, but by what they chose to make of it. They had learned that sometimes the hardest thing to do wasn't confronting the person who hurt you. It was confronting the parts of yourself that you had been avoiding, the parts that needed to heal. And in that moment, they knew they had done just that. They had healed. And no matter where they went from here, they would carry that strength with them. As they stepped away from the mansion, the weight that had once burdened them seemed to lift with every step. The anger that had clouded their thoughts for so long, the resentment that had built up over the years no longer held power over them. It was a strange sensation, liberation, but not in the way they had imagined. For so long they had believed that seeking revenge or forcing their father to feel the same pain they had felt would be the answer. But standing there, in the quiet aftermath of their confrontation, they realized that the greatest form of justice was not in making him suffer, but in freeing themselves from the hold he had over their life. The streets were quiet, the sounds of the city distant and muted by the inner peace that was settling within them. They had expected to feel some sort of victory, some overwhelming emotion that would mark the end of their journey. But instead, there was only calm. It wasn't the dramatic release they had imagined. It was quiet. It was real. They walked, their pace steady, their mind clear. The anger, the years of frustration, the endless questioning, it had all faded. In its place was something new, something unfamiliar but comforting. Acceptance. It wasn't that they forgave Richard, not yet, and maybe never, but they had accepted that his actions were his to live with, not theirs to carry. And in that acceptance, they found their own peace. They didn't need to hold on to the past any longer. The years of suffering had shaped them, but they had also made them stronger. They could see now that they had the power to decide how their story would continue. And they would no longer let anyone, least of all their father, determine that. They had taken back control of their life. No more running. No more hiding. They were not defined by what had happened to them, nor by the people who had failed them. They were defined by their choices, by the strength they had found in themselves, and by the future they were now free to build. As they continued down the path, they couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not for their father, but for the journey itself. It had taught them something invaluable, that no matter how dark things had seemed, no matter how much they had been made to feel small, they had always had the strength to rise, and that strength had brought them here, to a place of peace, to a place where the past no longer had the power to control them. The rest of the world would continue to turn, but they would no longer be waiting for it to decide their fate. They had made their own choices. They had chosen freedom. As they walked away from the mansion, the familiar weight of the past seemed to fade with each step. It was as though the world around them had shifted, and they could finally breathe freely again. The years of anger, the memories of betrayal, no longer held them captive. The air felt different, almost clearer, as if they had just been freed from a burden they didn't even know they were still carrying. They had never imagined that confronting their father would feel so anticlimactic. In their mind, it had always been something grand, a showdown of sorts, with emotions running wild and a sense of victory at the end. But in reality, it wasn't like that. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about them, about reclaiming their own power, about realizing that they had always been strong enough to survive without him. For years they had been stuck in a loop, thinking that if they could just get an apology, if they could just hear him say he was sorry, it would fix everything. But now, standing in the aftermath of the confrontation, they understood that they didn't need his words to heal. They had already healed themselves. The past would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to define them. They had spent too long waiting for someone else to make things right, and it was only now that they realized the only person who could do that was themselves. It was a bittersweet realization, but it was freeing. They didn't need him to say sorry or beg for forgiveness. What they needed was to let go of the anger, to stop carrying the weight of his actions in their heart. They had done that. They had freed themselves. And that was the victory. The night had fallen and the city around them was still buzzing with life, but they felt like they were in a different world, one where they could finally move forward, without the chains of their past weighing them down. They didn't need to look back anymore. The old wounds would still be there, but they had learned that it was okay to move forward in spite of them. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a future that was no longer controlled by it. They had done it. They had faced the person who had caused them the most pain, and they had walked away, stronger than before. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they could finally live for themselves, not for the approval of someone who had never really cared. They were free, and that freedom felt like a weight had been lifted from their chest. The future was theirs to shape. The healing wasn't over, but they had taken the first step, and that was more than enough for now. As the days went by, the sense of peace they had found began to settle deeper into their being. They had expected the weight of the confrontation to linger, to gnaw at them. But surprisingly, it didn't. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to creep back in, when the anger and hurt tried to resurface. But they didn't allow it. They had learned something vital during that moment of confrontation with Richard. They were in control now. The past, no matter how painful, no longer had the power to shape their every action, their every thought. They were not the same person they had been before. They were different, stronger, more resilient, more self-aware. It wasn't that the memories had faded or that the pain had disappeared completely. But it was no longer the first thing they thought of when they woke up in the morning. It no longer defined them. The power they had given away for so long, hoping that someone else could fix it, was now in their own hands. They had taken their life back piece by piece, and with each step, they felt more whole. There were days when they allowed themselves to feel the weight of the journey, to acknowledge the scars that would always remain, but those days were fewer now. They had built a life outside of their father's shadow, and they realized that they no longer needed his validation. They no longer craved his approval or his love. They had found their own sense of worth, and it came from within. It wasn't easy, and there were times when they doubted themselves, when they questioned whether they had done the right thing by confronting him. But as time passed, they grew more certain. They had made the right choice. The peace they had found wasn't just about letting go of their father's actions. It was about reclaiming their own power. They had realized that the greatest form of justice wasn't making someone else pay for their mistakes. It was about finding the strength to move forward, to heal, to become someone who was not defined by the past. The more they reflected on it, the more they saw how much they had grown. They had learned to forgive not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They had let go of the chains of anger and resentment that had bound them for so long. They had learned to love themselves in a way they had never thought possible. And that was the most profound healing of all. They didn't need anything from Richard anymore. Not his apology, not his love, not his approval. They had everything they needed within themselves. It was a liberating realization, one that would carry them forward for the rest of their life. They were no longer waiting for someone else to fix them. They were already whole. As time passed, their life took on a new rhythm. They had moved on from the past, but in a way, they carried the lessons it had taught them with them. The journey of confronting their father, of reclaiming their own narrative, had shaped them in ways they could never have imagined before. They found themselves more present, more attuned to their own needs, and more capable of recognizing their own worth. They had stopped measuring their success or happiness by anyone else's standards. The people they had once sought approval from no longer held any sway over their sense of self. They had learned to define themselves on their own terms. The scars, while still there, no longer had the power to haunt them. They had become symbols of resilience, proof of the strength that had always been within them. And while the journey had been painful, it had ultimately led them to a place of deep self-awareness and peace. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, no longer controlled their future. It was just a part of their story, a story they had the power to rewrite every day. They had faced their greatest fear, not in the form of their father, but in the realization that they had been the ones holding themselves back. The freedom they felt wasn't about the absence of pain. It was about the ability to move forward in spite of it, to not let it dictate the direction of their life. And while they knew they would always carry the memory of that painful chapter, they no longer allowed it to define who they were. They were not a victim of their past. They were a survivor. And in that survival, they had found strength, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of self. Their journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more to experience. But they knew, with certainty, that they had the tools to face whatever came next. They had finally become the person they were always meant to be, someone who was no longer waiting for anyone else's approval, someone who was no longer defined by what had been done to them. They had taken back their life, their power, and their peace. They had found justice not in retribution but in the simple act of healing and moving forward. And that was more than enough. The storm that had once clouded their vision had passed. Now they were ready to embrace the future with open arms, unburdened and free.